It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those rare, quiet moments after school when nothing seemed urgent and the world felt a little softer around the edges. My best friend had invited me over, and I didn't expect anything more than a few hours of idle chatter, snacks, and the occasional teasing over video games. But the moment I stepped into their house, there was something subtly different in the air, something that made me notice details I normally wouldn't. His mother, she was the reason. I had always known her from casual visits, but today she seemed more present. She moved through the kitchen with an ease that was mesmerizing, a quiet elegance that made her stand out without effort. She wasn't flashy, but there was a gentle command to her presence, the kind that made people lean in when she spoke and pause when she laughed. I noticed the faint trace of her perfume, vanilla and jasmine, soft but lingering, and it seemed to settle around the room, wrapping me in a warmth I didn't quite understand. It wasn't overwhelming. It was subtle, like a whisper of calm that made the space feel intimate, even though we were just in a brightly lit kitchen. She caught my gaze briefly, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes held something unexpected, a spark of amusement, a hint of curiosity. My chest tightened slightly, a nervous flutter I couldn't quite place. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the novelty of being in her space. But even as I laughed at a joke my friend made, I realized I was watching her more than anyone else. The way she poured a glass of water, the tilt of her head as she listened, the subtle curve of her smile, it all drew me in. Then, almost accidentally, there was contact. My hand brushed against hers as I reached for a snack. It was fleeting, nothing more than a touch to pass a plate, but it sent a ripple through me. Her skin was warm and soft, her fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. I noticed how natural it felt, and yet how much my mind fixated on it, replaying the sensation like a secret I wasn't supposed to have. I caught myself studying the little details, the gentle sway of her hair as she moved, the rhythm of her breathing when she laughed, the quiet way she observed everything around her without ever seeming rushed. It was strange realizing that someone could feel so familiar and yet so entirely captivating. By the time the afternoon waned and the sunlight slanted lazily through the windows, I felt an unfamiliar curiosity blooming in me, one that wasn't just about the obvious physical attraction, but about the person she was. There was a depth there I wanted to understand, a warmth and confidence tempered with quiet vulnerability that seemed almost untouchable. And in that moment, as she handed me a cup of tea with a smile that lingered in my chest longer than it should have, I knew this was the spark, the subtle pull that would make everything different. Something about her presence had awakened a curiosity in me, a desire to notice, to understand, to quietly linger in the same space as her. I didn't know it yet, but this afternoon would be the first step toward a story I wasn't ready to name, one that would slowly unfold, tenderly and impossibly, in ways I could only begin to imagine. The house had emptied slightly after the small gathering, leaving only me and her in the living room. My friend had gone to answer a phone call, and the room suddenly felt quieter, more intimate, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. I tried to focus on tidying up, stacking magazines, and arranging cushions, but I couldn't ignore the subtle shift in energy between us. She was sitting on the sofa, flipping through a photo album, her posture relaxed but poised. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, catching the subtle glint of her hair as it fell across her shoulders, soft and effortless. She looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met, and it felt like she could see more than just me standing there. She could see the thoughts tangled in my mind, the curiosity that had started stirring in the kitchen. Then she leaned down to pick up a book I hadn't noticed lying on the floor. The movement was simple, mundane even, but I couldn't help noticing the elegance in it. The way her fingers curved around the spine, the gentle stretch of her arm, the slight furrow of her brow as she concentrated. I found myself holding my breath for a moment, acutely aware of her proximity, of the warmth radiating from her. When she handed me the book, our fingers brushed. Just a light, fleeting touch, but it lingered longer than necessary. A A small electric charge ran through me, subtle and unnerving, yet strangely comforting. I wanted to pull back, to remind myself that this was my friend's mother, that boundaries existed for a reason, but I couldn't. There was something about the quiet confidence in her touch, the unspoken trust she extended, that made it feel safe. She smiled softly, almost conspiratorially, and I realized she was aware of the effect she had, but there was no malice, no overt intention. It was just presence, calm, warm, and quietly commanding. Her laughter broke through the stillness at some minor comment I made, and it was light, genuine, infectious. I felt my own tension ease, but a new tension had begun to coil in my chest, the kind that makes you aware of every subtle movement, every soft glance. The room seemed to shrink in the best way, the ordinary furnishings fading into a blurred background as I focused entirely on her. I noticed how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the rhythm of her breathing, even the quiet way she adjusted the sleeve of her blouse. Every small gesture felt intentional, even though I knew it wasn't. It felt like I'd been tuned to notice her in a way I hadn't been tuned to notice anyone else before. There was a moment of silence then, a pause heavy with unspoken thoughts. She tilted her head slightly, watching me with a gentle curiosity, as if inviting me to speak or to reveal something I didn't yet understand about myself. I felt the pull to lean in, to linger in that space a little longer, to savor the warmth of her presence without needing words. By the time my friend returned, the moment had passed, but the tension lingered, quiet and insistent, like a secret humming in the air. I realized then that this afternoon was not just another visit. Something subtle had shifted between us, a slow, almost imperceptible spark, a hint of a connection that was about to grow in ways I couldn't yet predict, but that I couldn't ignore either. The moment came unexpectedly. I was about to gather my things and leave, thinking the afternoon's quiet had been nothing more than a pleasant, fleeting curiosity, when she leaned closer. The change in the air was almost imperceptible, but I felt it immediately, a subtle shift in warmth, an intimacy that didn't need words. Her voice, soft and deliberate, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "Want me to tell you what women really want?" It wasn't a question that demanded an answer, yet my chest tightened as if it were the only question that mattered in that moment. Her words were gentle, teasing, but there was a depth to them, a knowing that made my heart beat faster. The kind of knowing that comes from experience, from living, from understanding. We were inches apart, closer than I had expected. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, subtle but undeniable, a quiet pressure in the space between us that drew my attention like a magnet. The faint scent of vanilla and jasmine followed her, wrapping around me and embedding itself in the memory of the room. It was intoxicating, not in a dizzying, overwhelming way, but in a way that made me acutely aware of every small detail. Her lips didn't move far from my ear, and yet her words carried a weight that lingered in my chest long after they left her mouth. The soft brush of her hair against my shoulder as she leaned and sent shivers up my spine, a sensation I tried to dismiss but couldn't. Her presence was commanding and gentle all at once, a paradox that left me both exhilarated and nervous. I swallowed hard, trying to focus, but it was impossible. My mind was aware of her gaze. Though her eyes were not on mine, they seemed to linger on me in understanding, as if she could see the mixture of curiosity, hesitation, and something unnamed simmering just beneath the surface. Every subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the gentle brush of her hand against mine as she adjusted the book in my grip, felt deliberate and yet effortless. A pause hung between us. I could feel my pulse quickening, a warmth spreading from my chest and my hands, and I realized that in this single whisper, 1,000 unspoken emotions had been set into motion. I wanted to speak, to ask her what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. The tension was not uncomfortable. It was magnetic, pulling me into the orbit of her experience, her confidence, her quiet vulnerability. She straightened slowly, a playful glint in her eyes as she stepped back just enough to break the immediate proximity, but not enough to dissolve the intimacy. The whisper was gone, but its echo remained, lingering in the quiet room, in the faint smell of her perfume, in the warmth that seemed to cling to my skin long after she moved to another corner. As I left that afternoon, the words repeated in my mind, wanting to tell you what women really want. The whisper was more than just a teasing question. It was a spark, a beginning. Something had shifted in me, a curiosity mingled with admiration, something deeper that I didn't yet have a name for. And I knew, with an almost painful certainty, that I would carry this moment with me, replaying it over and over, waiting for the next step in a story that was only just beginning. The quiet of the house felt different now, charged with a subtle awareness that neither of us had tried to name. I lingered in the living room longer than necessary, partly because I didn't want to leave, partly because I was drawn to her in a way I hadn't expected. She noticed, of course, but instead of confronting it, she leaned back in her chair with a soft smile, her posture relaxed, almost inviting. You know, she began, her voice calm and measured, understanding people is less about what they say and more about what they don't. Her gaze met mine, steady but gentle, as if daring me to challenge her. I didn't. Instead, I leaned in slightly, curious and captivated, aware of every subtle movement she made, the way her fingers traced the edge of the book in her lap, the soft tilt of her head as she considered her words. She told stories from her own life, not with pride or showiness, but with a quiet honesty that made me feel as if I were being led into a private world. She spoke of past mistakes, moments of vulnerability, and times she had learned to trust her instincts about people, women, men, and the delicate interplay between them. Each story carried lessons, wrapped in humor, regret, or wisdom, and I found myself hanging on every word, not just because they were fascinating, but because they felt personal, as if she were slowly teaching me more about life, connection, and understanding than any book ever could. I noticed the subtle cues she gave, small gestures, fleeting touches, a hand brushing mine by accident when she reached for her cup. Each contact sent a quiet ripple through me, a tension I could neither name nor dismiss. Her warmth was steady and reassuring, yet there was an undercurrent of intimacy in the way she shared her space and her stories, a gentle magnetism that made the room feel smaller, more private. At one point, she paused and looked at me, the soft light from the window catching the highlights in her hair. It's not about knowing all the answers, she said. It's about being willing to notice, to listen, to feel the spaces between words. Her tone wasn't flirtatious, yet it carried a subtle weight, a reminder of the connection forming between us. Mutual, unspoken, and quietly charged. I caught myself staring, realizing that I was more aware of her than ever before. The curve of her smile, the warmth in her hands, the rhythm of her breathing. I felt a mix of admiration, curiosity, and something deeper I didn't want to name yet. There was a pull I couldn't resist, a desire to learn not just what she wanted, but how she saw the world. By the time our conversation tapered off, I felt a new layer of connection forming. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was respect, fascination, and a subtle intimacy that went beyond words. The afternoon had shifted something inside me, an awareness of her presence, a quiet longing, and a growing understanding that this relationship, whatever it was becoming, would be defined not by haste or expectation, but by patience, attention, and the slow unfolding of trust. As I finally rose to leave, I felt the lingering warmth of her gaze, a gentle pull that made stepping away unexpectedly difficult. That day wasn't just about stories or advice. It was the first true moment of understanding between us, the kind that would quietly shape every interaction that followed. The days after that afternoon felt different, though outwardly nothing had changed. I found myself replaying our conversation over and over, memorizing the subtle inflections in her voice, the tilt of her head, the way her hands moved as she gestured. I knew it was unusual to feel so drawn to my friend's mother, but I couldn't help it. The pull between admiration, curiosity, and something unnamed had grown into a quiet, insistent tension I didn't know how to resolve. Every time I visited, I became acutely aware of her presence. The simple act of being near her made my chest tighten, my pulse quicken. I noticed the smallest gestures, a stray hair brushing her cheek, the warmth in her eyes when she smiled, the soft hum of her laughter that seemed to— It wasn't just attraction, it was a heightened awareness, a quiet yearning I didn't fully understand. She noticed, too. Her subtle glances carried a knowing amusement, a gentle teasing that left me both flustered and intrigued. One afternoon, as I hesitated over some comment, she raised an eyebrow, a soft smirk playing at the corners of her lips. Thinking too hard again, she asked, her tone light but laden with meaning. The words were casual, but the way she said them made me painfully aware of the way she could read me, understand me, even when I tried to hide my feelings. This created an internal conflict I couldn't shake. I told myself it was inappropriate to feel this way, that boundaries existed for a reason. Yet, every time she laughed, every time our hands brushed, or her gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, my resolve faltered. I was caught between admiration and desire, between respect and longing, and it was intoxicating. The tension wasn't uncomfortable, it was magnetic. I found myself cherishing the small interactions, the quiet moments when it was just the two of us in the room, suspended in unspoken understanding. A shared glance, a brief touch, or even a pause in conversation felt layered with meaning. My mind was constantly aware of her presence, analyzing, remembering, longing, and yet, amid the tension, there was something profoundly safe in her confidence. She never pressed, never forced anything. Her teasing was gentle, her smiles warm, her touches fleeting but intentional. She allowed me to navigate my emotions while guiding me, teaching me subtly through example, laughter, and quiet insight. By the end of each visit, I left with a mix of awe and frustration. Awed by her presence, frustrated at my own inability to name or act on the feelings swelling within me. And yet, I knew this struggle was part of the journey, part of the slow-burning connection that had begun between us, a connection that would shape every conversation, every glance, and every quiet, electric moment that followed. It was one of those evenings when the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet hum of the house and the soft golden light spilling through the windows. I had come over under the pretense of helping with something trivial, a shelf that needed adjusting, a book that needed sorting, but somehow, as always, the purpose of my visit had shifted. I found myself sitting closer than usual on the sofa, aware of the subtle warmth radiating from her, the way the sunlight caught the highlights in her hair. We began talking about things we hadn't before. Childhood memories, dreams that never fully materialized, regrets that lingered quietly in the back of the mind. Her voice was slower now, more reflective, carrying the weight of lived experience, and I listened intently. Every word she spoke felt intentional, layered with honesty, humor, and a vulnerability that I hadn't seen in her before. It was mesmerizing. At one point, she placed her hand on my shoulder, not in a commanding way, not in a way that demanded attention, but as a gentle, grounding presence. The warmth of her palm spread through me, steady and reassuring, and I realized that I had been craving this quiet connection more than I had known. It wasn't just her physical presence. It was the intimacy of trust, of feeling seen without judgment, of knowing that in this small corner of the world, we could be entirely ourselves. I became acutely aware of her movements. The soft stretch of her arm as she reached for a book, the subtle brush of her fingers against mine when handing it over, the tilt of her head as she listened. Every gesture was small, deliberate, and intimate, weaving a tension that was both comforting and exhilarating. I wanted to stay in this space forever, to let the quiet understanding between us linger. Her laughter broke the calm at one point, light and genuine, and I felt it resonate deep in my chest. I wanted to lean closer, to feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine, to share a quiet moment of unspoken connection. And yet, I hesitated, acutely aware of the delicate line we were walking. The age gap, the social boundaries, the unspoken rules of propriety. But there was no pressure in her presence, only a gentle invitation to be near her, to share thoughts and stories, to linger in the quiet intimacy of simply being together. I felt my walls lowering, my usual nervousness dissolving in the warmth of her understanding gaze. The slow rhythm of our conversation, punctuated by soft touches and lingering glances, made me realize how deeply this connection was forming. Not just attraction, but trust, respect, and a subtle, unspoken desire that neither of us yet dared to name. By the time I finally stood to leave, I felt a quiet ache in my chest, not of longing, but of fulfillment. She had opened a door into a part of life I hadn't known I was missing, the gentle, patient intimacy of someone who truly sees you. The warmth of her hand lingered in my memory, the quiet steadiness of her presence embedded in my mind, and I knew that the bond we had formed in those simple, shared moments was profound, delicate, and utterly unforgettable. By the time I returned the next afternoon, there was a gentle ease in the air, the kind that only comes after trust has begun to settle between two people. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old books, the soft sunlight painting golden streaks across the living room floor. She was sitting on the sofa, a book balanced in her lap, and when she looked up, the smile she gave me felt warmer, softer, like a secret only she and I shared. We began talking, as we often did, about small, ordinary things, the weather, a recent movie, the mundane chaos of everyday life. But beneath the surface, the tension we had carefully nurtured in moments of stolen glances and lingering touches hummed quietly, like a thread tying us together in ways neither of us had fully acknowledged. There was no need for overt words, no need to force what had slowly, tenderly grown. It simply existed, a subtle intimacy that filled the space around us. At one point, I reached for a mug of tea she had handed me, and our fingers brushed lightly. The contact was fleeting, yet lingered in my chest, sparking that familiar warmth I had come to anticipate. She caught my eye, a glint of amusement and understanding in her gaze, and for a moment, it felt as if time had paused, just the two of us in a quiet, unspoken world. We laughed together over something silly, a shared joke that seemed trivial but carried the weight of connection. Her laughter, warm and melodic, vibrated in the room, and I felt it resonate in my own chest. I leaned back slightly, letting the comfort of her presence wash over me. It was a strange, thrilling peace, the kind of peace that comes when attraction and trust coexist, when admiration and longing mingle without pressure, when hearts quietly sync without needing to speak. As the conversation tapered off, she moved closer to adjust a cushion beside me, her hand brushing the edge of my arm in the most casual yet intimate gesture. I caught a faint scent of her perfume, vanilla and jasmine mingling with the warmth of the sunlight, and my chest tightened in a way that felt both exhilarating and safe. There was no rush, no demand, just a gentle, steady closeness that spoke volumes. Before I left, she smiled at me in a way that lingered, and I realized I didn't want to leave. But I also knew that this wasn't about fleeting moments or instant gratification. This was about connection, about trust, about a slow burn intimacy that had been built carefully, intentionally, and beautifully. I stood, hesitated, and then stepped toward the door, carrying with me the warmth of her gaze, the echo of her laughter, and the quiet ache of admiration that had grown into something profoundly meaningful. As I walked away, I felt the lingering touch of her presence, the subtle warmth, the steady confidence, the quiet empathy. The story between us wasn't one of dramatic declarations or rushed romance. It was one of patience, of understanding, of moments so small and fleeting they almost went unnoticed, yet each one had built a foundation that neither time nor circumstance could erase. And in that quiet, golden afternoon light, I realized that what had started as curiosity had blossomed into something rare and tender, a connection that was as gentle as it was unforgettable, as profound as it was beautifully restrained. The memory of her smile, the brush of her hand, the whisper of her voice, it would stay with me forever, a warm, lingering echo of the slow, deliberate, and utterly human intimacy we had discovered together.